Imagine bypassing your doctor, just hacking past the clinical corporate dashboard entirely and downloading the raw bare metal hex code of how your body actually works.
Right, not just a standard blood panel.
Exactly, not a generic medical chart telling you your cholesterol is a little high, but a highly classified, incredibly specific user manual for your exact biology.
It's wild to even think about.
It really is. That is the premise of what we are unpacking today, and honestly, it completely shatters the way we normally think about human health. We are looking at a document that reads less like a standard diagnostic file and more like, well, a cyberpunk tech schematic for a human V2.0 operating system.
And the framing of the source material is what makes it so captivating. I mean, usually when we look at health data, we are just fumbling around in the dark.
Yeah, totally.
We look at outward symptoms, right? Fatigue, anxiety, lack of focus. And we try to reverse engineer this incredibly complex machinery operating beneath the surface through pure trial and error.
Which is so frustrating.
It is. But this document strips away all the guesswork. We aren't looking at generic one-size-fits-all advice here. We are looking at a hyper-specific bare metal diagnostic for an individual biological node identified in these sources as Brittney, or as the file actually designates her based on her genetic operating system, the architect weaver.
Which is such a cool title.
Yeah.
And the story of how this data was even acquired sets the tone for everything we're going to discuss.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it was pulled by an individual identified only as the pilot, who was also referred to in the logs as James or the Vanguard. He didn't just walk into a clinic and ask for a standard test.
No, not at all.
The sources describe him utilizing something called the feral route to extract this raw biological and ancestral telemetry. He essentially jailbroke the genetic data to get the unfiltered, untampered truth of Brittney's biological hardware.
And you really have to notice the language the pilot uses throughout this documentation. He entirely abandons any kind of clinical sterility.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a doctor wrote it.
Not even close. He uses terms like the analog wasteland to describe our modern environment and the beige world to describe the artificial one-size-fits-all structures of modern medicine and society.
Beige world, yeah.
And he uses biological hardware to describe the physical body. It's a completely different paradigm. It forces us to view the human body as a complex piece of systems architecture governed by hard-coded rules, specific fuel requirements, and rigid operational limits.
Which is exactly the mission of this deep dive. We're going to decode this unique user manual. We're going to explore how an individual's genetic code, from the microscopic way they manage neurotransmitters all the way back to their deep mitochondrial history from the Ice Age, shapes their entire interface with reality.
It's a massive scope.
It is. Imagine you've just been handed the ultimate tech spec sheet for a human being. It tells you exactly what fuel they need to run efficiently, what environmental inputs will crash their system, and how they are wired to connect to the network of other humans around them.
And as we unpack the mechanics of this specific individual, the architect weaver, it really forces you to view your own life through this exact same lens.
Right. Like asking yourself questions.
Exactly. Like, how many of your daily struggles, your moments of burnout, or your friction with the world are actually just system errors caused by not reading your own manual? We operate our bodies blindly, assuming the default settings, the beige world settings, work for everyone.
But they don't.
No, this telemetry proves in staggering biological detail that the default settings are a complete myth.
So let's open up the hood and look at the command center. Before we can understand how this biological machine moves through the physical world or interacts with others, we really have to look at how she manages her internal power supply.
The engine.
Right. The manual identifies her baseline as the warrior phenotype, which is governed by her COMT engine, specifically the RS4680A genotype. Now, I know COMT is a major player in neurobiology, but what is that engine actually doing on a microscopic level?
Let's break down the mechanics of it. So COMT stands for Catechol-O-methyltransferase.
That's a mouthful.
It really is. Basically, it is an enzyme, which means it's a specialized protein designed to trigger a specific chemical reaction in the body. In this case, the COMT enzyme operates heavily in the prefrontal cortex,
Which is the front part of the brain.
Yes, the part responsible for executive function, planning, complex problem solving, and short-term memory. Its job is to break down and clear away a specific class of neurotransmitters called catecholamines.
Which includes dopamine, right? The chemical we always associate with focus, reward, and motivation.
Dopamine, epinephrine, which is basically adrenaline, and norepinephrine. When you are thinking intensely, when you're stressed, or when you are actively engaged in a complex task, your brain floods the prefrontal cortex with these chemicals to facilitate rapid neural communication.
Okay, so it floods the engine to make you think faster.
Exactly. But once the thought is processed or the stressor is gone, those chemicals can't just sit there. If they linger, they create neurological static.
Oh, I see.
So the COMT enzyme is the molecular cleanup crew. It binds to the dopamine, chemically alters it, and clears it out of the synapse so your brain can reset.
Okay, so she has the AA variant of this gene. And the manual explicitly calls this a slow-clearing engine. What does that mean for her actual day-to-day brain function?
The AA variant literally alters the structural shape of the COMT enzyme, making it less stable at normal body temperatures.
So it's a structural difference.
Yes. Because of this structural difference, her specific cleanup crew operates at roughly 1/3 to 1/4 the speed of someone with the fast clearing variant.
Wow, that is significantly slower.
She clears dopamine very, very slowly, and as a result, her prefrontal cortex is naturally saturated with baseline dopamine and adrenaline.
And the manual points out that in quiet, low-friction environments, this saturation is actually a massive
A
advantage.
huge advantage, yeah.
It grants her elite executive function, intense focus, and the ability to weave complex long-term plans. I mean, that's the genesis of the Architect Reaver title, right? She doesn't need external chaos, what the pilot calls the swamp, to boot up her system.
Right, and contrast her system with someone who has the fast clearing variant, which is often called the warrior baseline.
Okay, how do they operate?
Their enzymes clear dopamine so rapidly that their baseline levels are very low. To get enough dopamine into their prefrontal cortex to actually focus and execute a task, they need intense external stimulation.
Like a deadline.
Exactly. They need a looming deadline, a high-stakes crisis, or just a heavily caffeinated, chaotic environment. They use the friction of the swamp to jumpstart their engine.
But Brittney's engine is already running rich. In a quiet, structured environment, her saturated dopamine levels allow her to hold on to highly complex variables simultaneously.
She doesn't need the jumpstart.
Right. She can see the long-term architecture of a project and intricately weave those threads together without requiring constant external hits of stimulation. Her baseline is already optimized for deep, sustained focus.
Which is a beautiful piece of biological hardware, provided the environment remains controlled.
Yeah, provided.
But the manual immediately introduces a staggering complication.
Yeah, this is where I really started questioning the evolutionary logic of this system, because the manual pairs this elite high-performance brain with a severe restriction in the body's fuel pump.
The MTHFR gene?
Exactly. The file outlines her MTHFR gene, specifically the RS188011331GG variant. It states her body fundamentally struggles to synthesize methyl donors.
And to understand the gravity of this restriction, we really have to look at the methylation cycle. It is arguably the most critical biochemical gear system in the human body.
Okay, what does it actually do?
Methylation is the process of taking a single carbon atom and 3 hydrogen atoms, which is a methyl group, and attaching it to other molecules. It sounds incredibly simple, but that tiny chemical tag acts as an on and off switch for DNA. It manages inflammation, and crucially for our architect weaver, it is the fundamental raw material required to build neurotransmitters.
Wait, hold on. I'm looking at this architecture and it seems like a glaring contradiction.
It is.
You're saying she has this elite brain that requires precise management of neurotransmitters to maintain her focus, but her body can't even manufacture the basic chemical tags needed to build or clear those neurotransmitters.
That's the paradox.
Biologically speaking, how does a system like that not just immediately collapse? It sounds like dropping a massive V8 racing engine into a car, but supplying it with a fuel line the width of a coffee stirrer.
That is the perfect analogy, and you've hit on the exact systemic vulnerability the pilot flagged in the telemetry. It is a dangerous, profound paradox.
So what's happening mechanically?
The MTHFR gene provides the instructions for making an enzyme that converts the folate you get from food into its active form, called 5-MTHF. That active folate is the primary driver of the methylation gear.
Okay.
Because Brittney has the GG variant, the shape of her MTHFR enzyme is severely compromised. Its efficiency in producing active folate drops by roughly 70 to 75%.
So her fuel pump is literally operating at a quarter of its necessary capacity.
Exactly. She is starved of methyl donors. And this creates a terrifying scenario when you combine it with her slow-clearing COMT engine.
Because if she gets stressed,
Right. Imagine taking this beautifully calibrated, slow-clearing brain that relies on low-friction environments and dropping it into a highly stressful, chaotic situation, the invisible crush of the modern world.
The engine floods.
It completely floods. The stress response triggers a massive release of dopamine, adrenaline, and cortisol into her prefrontal cortex. Because her COMT cleanup crew is structurally slow, those stress chemicals linger.
They just sit there.
Yeah. Her brain becomes overwhelmed by chemical static. She loses her ability to weave, the architecture crumbles.
But it gets worse, right?
Huh?
Because to rebuild the structural integrity of her brain after a stress flood, or to synthesize the balancing chemicals to calm the system down, she needs those methyl donors.
She needs the fuel that her MTHFR restriction prevents her from making.
Right.
The race car revs into the red zone, the engine bay floods with exhaust, and the fuel line cannot deliver the necessary components to cool the system down or repair the microscopic damage.
That sounds exhausting.
The manual identifies the ultimate threat here as systemic exhaustion. It's not just feeling tired, it is a fundamental biochemical depletion where the hardware simply cannot run the software anymore.
It really reframes the way we look at burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Think about your own life, your own engine. Do you thrive when a million things are happening at once? Does chaos make you feel alert? Or do you require low-friction, quiet, and rigid structure to unlock your best thinking?
It's a vital question.
As this bare metal manual shows, struggling in a chaotic office environment isn't a lack of discipline or a moral failing. For someone like the architect weaver, trying to operate like a fast-clearing warrior in the swamp will lead to physical and neurological breakdown. It is hard-coded into her biology.
And that biological hard-coding extends far beyond just internal chemical management. The manual smoothly pivots from the internal engine to how this system interfaces with external physical inputs.
Like the environment.
Right. If she ingests a chemical from the beige world, or if she has to exert physical force, how does the hardware handle it?
That brings us to the system's firewall and kinetic chassis. Let's start with the firewall, which the telemetry identifies as her liver, governed by the CYP1A2 gene, specifically the AA variant. The manual classifies her as a rapid clearer of caffeine.
So the CYP1A2 gene controls a specific enzyme in the liver belonging to the cytochrome P450 family. These are the liver's primary detoxifiers.
Okay, so they clean the blood.
Exactly. Their job is to identify foreign compounds like medications, toxins, or in this case, caffeine, and break them down so they can be excreted. The AA variant means her specific liver enzyme is highly inducible and extremely efficient.
So it works fast.
Very fast. When she drinks a cup of coffee, her liver firewall kicks in immediately and metabolizes the caffeine molecule at top speed.
On the surface, if you're living in the modern beige world where coffee is the default fuel, having a liver that clears caffeine efficiently sounds fantastic. You drink it, you get the boost, and your body clears it so you can sleep.
It sounds ideal.
But the manual issues a massive system warning here. We can't look at the liver in isolation. We have to look at the entire system's architecture.
Because we have a profound mismatch in processing speeds here. We have a highly efficient, rapid clearing liver paired with a structurally slow clearing brain.
This is one of my favorite descriptions in the entire source document. The manual says that even though her liver rips the caffeine out of her bloodstream quickly, her slow-clearing COMT engine holds onto the neurological static that the caffeine triggered in the brain. It calls the resulting state bejangled nerve pops.
Bejangled nerve pops. It is the perfect mechanical description. Think about the biological cascade happening here.
Walk me through it.
She drinks caffeine. The caffeine crosses the blood-brain barrier and blocks adenosine receptors, which prevents her from feeling tired, while simultaneously stimulating the release of dopamine and adrenaline.
Right, the boost.
Exactly. A few hours later, her rapid clearing liver has successfully metabolized the caffeine. The physical molecule is gone. Her heart rate might drop back to normal. The firewall did its job.
But the brain is still a disaster zone. The caffeine triggered a dopamine and adrenaline release, and her slow COMT cleanup crew is still struggling to sweep up that chemical flood.
Exactly.
So the physical movement stops, but the engine bay is still vibrating, completely filled with heat and exhaust fumes.
Bejangled nerve pops. She is physically exhausted because the stimulant is gone from her bloodstream, but she is neurologically wired because the secondary chemical cascade is trapped in her prefrontal cortex.
That sounds awful.
It is, and this is a crucial warning for her maintenance protocol. It is incredibly easy for her to abuse stimulants because her body doesn't give her the standard physical warning signs like sustained palpitations. The liver hides the damage being done to the brain.
From the chemical firewall, the manual moves to the physical frame itself, the kinetic chassis. It details her ACTN3 gene, highlighting the CT variant, and designates her physical build as the hybrid kinetic model.
Now, ACTN3 is fascinating because it is one of the most well-studied performance genes in human biology. It provides the instructions for producing a protein called alpha-actinin-3. This protein is exclusively found in fast-twitch muscle fibers.
Let's break down the muscle fiber types for a second so we understand the mechanism here. What is the difference between fast twitch and slow twitch?
It really comes down to how the muscle cell generates energy. Slow-twitch fibers are built for endurance. They rely heavily on oxygen and are packed with mitochondria, allowing them to burn fuel slowly over long periods.
Think of a marathon runner.
Right. Fast-twitch fibers, on the other hand, generate energy anaerobically without oxygen using a process called glycolysis. They contract incredibly quickly and with immense force, but they fatigue almost immediately.
Like an Olympic weightlifter or a 100-meter sprinter?
Exactly. The alpha-actinin-3 protein essentially cross-links the filaments within these fast-twitch fibers, allowing them to generate that explosive kinetic power.
The manual notes that a pure power sprinter would have 2 functional copies of this gene, giving them maximum explosive capability. But Brittney has the CT variant. She has 1 functional copy and 1 non-functional copy.
The hybrid kinetic model?
Right. The manual calls this the hybrid kinetic model because she isn't locked into being a pure sprinter or a pure marathoner.
Her muscle fibers represent a structural compromise. She produces enough alpha-actinin-3 to maintain functional fast-twitch capacity, but she also retains a high density of efficient slow-twitch endurance fibers. Biologically, she possesses an adaptable baseline.
And when you map that physical chassis onto her neurological profile, the architect Weaver designation becomes incredibly cohesive.
It really pulls it all together.
An architect doesn't just need the explosive burst of energy to kick down a door. They need the sustained physical and mental endurance to oversee a long-term construction project. But they also can't be so fragile that a sudden physical demand breaks their system.
She can pivot. If the environment requires sustained low-level effort, her slow-twitch fibers support her. If the environment suddenly demands variable kinetic output, her fast-twitch capacity engages.
It's her resilient build.
It reinforces the idea that her hardware is built for resilience, structural organization, and navigating complex terrain over time, rather than just chaotic, short-duration bursts.
Okay, so we have an internal engine that requires quiet structure to avoid chemical flooding. We have a firewall that processes external stimulants quickly, but leaves the brain vibrating. And we have an adaptable hybrid physical chassis.
That's the individual node.
Right, but a human node doesn't exist in a vacuum. We operate in a vast network of other human beings. How does this highly specific operating system handle social tethering?
This is where the manual introduces what I consider the most elegant paradox in the telemetry. It details her oxytocin receptor, the OXTR gene, specifically the RS53576AG variant, and it gives her the operational title of tactical empath.
We hear about oxytocin all the time in the beige world. It's the cuddle hormone, right? The bonding chemical, the neurotransmitter that drives human connection and trust.
Exactly. The OXTR gene determines the structure and density of the receptors in the brain that actually catch and process that oxytocin. The telemetry shows she carries the G allele.
What does the G allele do?
In genetic literature, the G allele is heavily associated with profound empathy, pro-social behavior, and a deep ability to read the emotional states of other nodes in the network. She intuitively feels the connections.
But the manual also states she carries the A allele, which introduces a completely different dynamic. The A allele allows her to detach. It explicitly states she can operate under a lone wolf protocol.
The paradox.
Yeah, when I first read this, I was deeply confused. It sounds like trying to be a sponge that absorbs everything while simultaneously being a brick wall. How can her neurology support deep empathetic tethering, but also severe detachment?
If you view it purely as a personality trait, it seems contradictory. But if you view it through the lens of systems, architecture, and biological load management, it is a brilliant self-preservation mechanism. We have to look at the whole system. Remember her COMT engine?
The slow clearing cleanup crew.
Right. If Brittney had 2 copies of the G allele, if she were a pure empath with no capacity for biological detachment, the emotional weight of the human network would be catastrophic to her hardware.
Because empathy is a chemical process.
Exactly. Empathy isn't just a feeling, it is a neurological event. It triggers the release of neurotransmitters, including dopamine and adrenaline, to mirror the state of the person you are observing.
Oh, I see where this is going.
If she were constantly absorbing the chaotic emotional states of everyone in the swamp, her slow clearing engine would flood continuously. She would never be able to clear the static. She would suffer total systemic burnout purely from social interaction.
Wow. So the detachment, the lone wolf protocol, isn't a lack of caring, it's a biological circuit breaker.
It is the ultimate tactical retreat. She can connect deeply, she can read the network, and she can weave social structures together beautifully. But the moment the friction of the external world threatens to flood her prefrontal cortex, the A allele allows her to flip the switch.
She unplugs.
She establishes rigid sovereign boundaries. She unplugs from the network, retreats into her safehood, and allows her slow engine the necessary time to clear the emotional neurotransmitters without taking on new inputs. She protects her hardware without losing her inherent empathetic capacity.
And understanding that load management fundamentally shifts how we view reward and satisfaction. The manual moves from social tethering to the system's reward loop, looking at her dopamine receptor density, the DRD2-ANKK1 gene, RS1-800-497G gene. It concludes that she has standard, healthy receptor density. What is the actual mechanism of a dopamine receptor?
Think of neurotransmitters like dopamine as molecular keys floating through the synaptic fluid. To actually create a feeling, to feel motivated, satisfied, or rewarded, those keys have to fit into specific locks on the surface of the next neuron.
Okay, the keys need locks.
Yes, those locks are the receptors. The DRD2 gene dictates how many of those locks are built and how efficiently they catch the dopamine keys.
The manual contrasts her healthy baseline with what it calls a reward deficiency. Let's explore that alternative to understand why her system operates the way it does.
Individuals with reward deficiency syndrome have a compromised DRD2 gene. They have significantly fewer receptors, or the receptors they do have are misshapen and inefficient.
So they don't have enough working locks.
Right. Because they lack enough working locks, a normal amount of baseline dopamine doesn't register. They constantly feel a baseline state of understimulation, apathy, or even subtle dread.
So they need more keys.
A massive amount of keys. To feel a normal level of satisfaction, or simply to feel alive, they must engage in behaviors that flood the brain with massive spikes of dopamine.
Like what?
These are the individuals driven to extreme thrill-seeking, intense gambling, substance abuse, or who naturally instigate chaotic, high-friction drama in their relationships just to get a neurological response. They need the volume turned up to maximum just to hear the music.
But because Brittney has a high density of healthy receptors, and because her slow COMT engine ensures her brain is already saturated with baseline dopamine, her reward loop is perfectly calibrated.
She doesn't need the extra keys.
Exactly. The manual notes that she finds deep biological satisfaction in quiet victories, in the structural organization of her environment, and in maintaining long-term stability. The artificial thrills of the beige world, the constant notifications, the chaotic drama, the engineered highs, aren't just unnecessary for her. They actively disrupt her carefully balanced system.
Which perfectly transitions us into the system warnings. We have mapped a meticulously calibrated V2.0 operating system. We know how it runs. Now we must examine what crashes it.
The danger zones.
Yes, the telemetry outlines the severe danger zones, starting with the pharmacogenomic threats, how her specific genetic hardware reacts to the synthetic interventions of modern medicine.
This section of the manual was staggering to read because the things that pose the absolute greatest threat to her operational integrity are pharmaceuticals that the beige world considers completely normal or even fundamentally helpful for productivity and mental health.
Right, let's look at them.
Let's start with standard stimulants, specifically medications like Adderall.
In the modern productivity-obsessed beige world, if you tell a doctor you are struggling to focus or you feel overwhelmed by your workload, the standard protocol is often to prescribe an amphetamine-based stimulant.
That's the go-to solution.
It is. And for someone with a fast-clearing brain that lacks baseline dopamine, an amphetamine artificially spikes their dopamine levels, finally allowing them to lock onto a task.
But the manual flashes a massive red warning for Brittney. It states that standard stimulants will not provide her with focus. They will induce severe anxiety, jitteriness, and potential panic.
Because we have to remember the mechanics of her COMT engine. Her prefrontal cortex is already saturated. Giving her Adderall is the biological equivalent of pouring high-octane jet fuel onto a fire that is already burning perfectly well in a small fireplace.
It blows out the windows.
It doesn't make the fire more efficient, it blows out the windows of the living room. Her slow cleanup crew cannot physically clear the synthetic deluge of dopamine. The system overloads, the architecture fails, and she is plunged into severe neurological distress.
The misalignment of standard medicine continues with antidepressants. The manual specifically warns against SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It notes that standard SSRIs may cause massive frustration and entirely fail to regulate her mood. Why?
To understand the failure, you have to look at how an SSRI actually works. An SSRI does not create serotonin. It simply blocks the brain from reabsorbing the serotonin that is already floating in the synapse, forcing it to linger longer and hit the receptors more often. It manages the existing traffic.
But we have to go back to her MTHFR restriction. Her fuel pump operates at 25% capacity.
Precisely. Because she lacks the methyl donors required to synthesize neurotransmitters, she isn't producing adequate levels of baseline serotonin in the first place. You cannot regulate a chemical that isn't being built.
That makes perfect sense.
It's like installing a multi-million-dollar traffic management system at an intersection where no cars are allowed to drive. The SSRI is trying to manage the serotonin traffic, but the MTHFR restriction means the cars never even make it onto the road. The intervention is completely useless because it ignores the bare metal hardware failure occurring upstream in the methylation cycle.
And the most severe pharmacogenomic warning in the entire file is something so mundane I almost couldn't believe it. Nitrous oxide. Laughing gas.
Oh, this one is brutal.
You go to the dentist to get a cavity filled, they offer you a little laughing gas to take the edge off. For the vast majority of the population, it's a completely benign, temporary intervention. But for the architect weaver, the manual classifies it as highly toxic.
Red alert.
It states that nitrous oxide oxidizes B12, crashes her already fragile folate pathway, and induces severe, prolonged brain fog. How does laughing gas crash her operating system?
This is a spectacular, terrifying example of interlocking biological pathways. The active center of a vitamin B12 molecule contains a cobalt ion. Nitrous oxide interacts directly with this cobalt, oxidizing it. Specifically, it changes the monovalent cobalt into a bivalent state.
Okay, in plain English.
In plain English, the laughing gas irreversibly alters the chemical structure of her B12, instantly deactivating it within her body.
Why is B12 so critical for her specifically?
Because vitamin B12 is the crucial linchpin in the methylation cycle. It is the cofactor required for the methionine synthase enzyme to function. Remember her MTHFR gene?
The restricted fuel pump.
Right. Her ability to produce active folate is already crippled. She's barely producing enough methyl donors to survive. If you introduce a gas that instantly destroys her B12, the entire fragile machinery of her methylation cycle completely halts.
It's like taking a sledgehammer to the last remaining structural support beam of a failing bridge.
Exactly. Without B12, the folate gets trapped. The production of dopamine, serotonin, and the myelin sheath that protects her nerves entirely stops. While a person with a robust, fast-running methylation cycle might recover from a hit of laughing gas in a few days, Brittney's system collapses.
She's just stuck in a fog.
She is plunged into a profound, chemically induced brain fog that her body lacks the fuel to repair.
It is wild to consider that the default medical interventions of the beige world are essentially poison to her specific hardware. And the threats aren't just chemical, they are environmental. The pilot warns of a conceptual threat called the invisible crush.
The invisible crush of a high-friction environment.
The manual contrasts her with a warrior genotype, someone with the RS4680GG variant who thrives on chaos. A warrior deflects environmental stress, they use the friction to sharpen their focus. But Brittney, the architect weaver, absorbs kinetic energy.
She takes it all in.
Right. If she is placed in a chaotic environment, an open plan office with constant interruptions, a toxic social dynamic, a high drama relationship, she takes all of that external friction directly into her slow clearing engine.
And that leads directly to the system flood. Every interruption, every piece of social drama triggers a catecholamine release. Her slow engine gets backed up. Her defense against the invisible crush is the rigorous defense of her safehood.
Her physical and operational boundaries.
Exactly. If she doesn't aggressively defend her safehood, if she allows the swamp to seep into her operational space, she suffers a total drop in executive function. She loses her ability to plan, to organize, to weave.
So, if the modern world is fundamentally hostile to her baseline, how do we keep this system from crashing? The manual outlines a highly specific maintenance protocol, a precise fuel requirement designed to bypass the beige world entirely. And the absolute foundation of this protocol is the methylation override.
The override. This is huge.
Because her MTHFR pump is structurally restricted, she must strictly, unconditionally avoid synthetic folic acid.
This is a critical point of divergence between the beige world and her biological reality. In an attempt to prevent neural tube defects in the general population, modern food systems heavily fortify processed foods with synthetic folic acid. It is in cheap supplements, enriched bread, pasta, and cereals. It is everywhere.
But the manual explicitly states her system cannot process it. It says synthetic folic acid literally clogs her receptors. What is the mechanism there?
Think of synthetic folic acid as raw, unrefined crude oil. A fully functioning MTHFR gene acts as a highly efficient oil refinery, taking that crude oil, running it through several complex chemical conversions, and turning it into usable gasoline.
Which, biologically speaking, is active L-methylfolate.
Exactly. But Brittney's refinery is fundamentally broken. It operates at a fraction of the necessary speed.
So what happens to all the crude oil?
It just sits there. The unmetabolized synthetic folic acid builds up in her bloodstream. And here is the fatal flaw. This synthetic crude oil has a higher binding affinity for her cellular receptors than the actual active fuel does.
Right, so it blocks the good stuff.
The synthetic sludge binds to the receptors, blocking them entirely. Even if her body manages to produce a tiny trickle of actual active folate, it can't get into the cells because the receptors are clogged with synthetic garbage. Eating enriched bread actively makes her engine run worse.
So the override is that she needs to ingest L-methylfolate directly, specifically the 5-MTHF molecule. This is bioactive folate that has already been broken down in a laboratory. It is pre-digested fuel.
It bypasses the broken refinery?
Exactly. It completely bypasses her broken MTHFR refinery and delivers the exact chemical tags her body requires to directly synthesize dopamine and serotonin. But the manual clearly states this fuel cannot operate in isolation. It requires a B12 synergy.
Biology is a system of interlocking gears. If the active L-methylfolate is the primary gear of the methylation cycle, methylcobalamin, the bioactive form of vitamin B12, is the secondary gear required to complete the rotation.
They need each other.
If she takes the pre-digested folate but lacks the active B12 to pass the methyl group along, the cycle stalls. The gears grind. The manual refers to this as engine knock. They must be deployed together to complete the circuit and provide her slow-clearing brain with the raw materials required to rebuild after a stress flood.
And finally, to manage that slow-clearing brain, the maintenance protocol introduces an engine lubricant, magnesium. Specifically, magnesium glycinate or threonate, because the manual notes these specific structural forms are capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier.
I absolutely love the manual's framing of magnesium as the biological janitor or structural damper. We have spent a lot of time discussing her COMT enzyme, the slow-moving molecular cleanup crew that sweeps dopamine out of her prefrontal cortex.
Or the AA variant.
While enzymes don't operate magically, they require physical cofactors to execute their chemical reactions. Magnesium is the absolute primary required cofactor for the COMT enzyme.
So it's essentially handing the slow janitor a significantly better broom.
Exactly. It doesn't rewrite her DNA. She will always possess the AA variant. She will always be a slow clearer. But providing her brain with an abundance of the specific biological lubricant that the enzyme requires ensures her cleanup crew is operating at its absolute maximum possible efficiency.
It just helps them out.
It helps clear out the neurological static just a little bit faster, softening the blow and preventing a catastrophic system flood when she inevitably encounters the invisible crush. It is the ultimate structural damper against environmental stress.
Okay, we have thoroughly mapped the present-day hardware. We understand the slow COMT engine, the restricted MTHFR fuel pump, the rapid CYP1A2 liver firewall, the adaptable ACTN3 physical chassis, the tactical empathy of her social network, and the exact precise maintenance protocols required to keep the architect weaver online and out of the swamp.
We've got the whole picture of the individual.
But the manual doesn't stop at the present day. And this is where the telemetry takes a breathtaking shift in scale. Where was this specific machine manufactured? To find out, the pilot used a decoder ring alongside that feral root to pull her maternal ancestral history. We are looking at section 5 of the data. Ancestral telemetry.
It is a staggering shift in perspective. We pull all the way back from microscopic enzymes and chemical methyl donors to the macro movements of human populations migrating across continents over millennia.
The manual explains that the pilot fed the raw hex code of her mitochondrial DNA directly into something called the lick decoder, and the bare metal translation reveals her maternal haplogroup is H5A1. Let's break this down biologically.
Sure.
When we talk about mitochondrial DNA in a maternal haplogroup, we are tracing a direct, completely unbroken line of female descent. From Brittney to her mother to her grandmother, great-grandmother, and so on, back thousands of years. Why specifically the maternal line?
It comes down to cellular mechanics at the moment of conception. Your nuclear DNA, the DNA that determines your eye color, your COMT engine, your NTHFR pump, is a 50-50 combination of your mother and father. It recombines and scrambles with every generation.
Okay, that's what we usually think of as DNA.
Right. But mitochondrial DNA is entirely different. Mitochondria are the microscopic power plants inside your cells. The sperm cell contains mitochondria in its tail to power its swimming, but when it fertilizes the egg, the tail falls off. Therefore, 100% of the mitochondrial DNA in the resulting embryo comes exclusively from the mother's egg.
Oh, wow. It doesn't scramble. It is a nearly perfect, unbroken biological hard drive passed from mother to child.
Precisely. Because it only changes through very rare random mutations over thousands of years, geneticists can use those mutations as chronological timestamps to trace lineages back through deep time.
Like tracking breadcrumbs.
Exactly. Haplogroup H is the overarching clan, the most common maternal lineage in Europe today. But the specific H5A1 branch is an ancient, highly specific offshoot.
The telemetry notes that the H5 lineage likely originated in the Caucasus region or southern Europe, right around the time of the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age. And as the glaciers finally began to retreat, this specific lineage spread across Europe. But there's a fascinating technical hiccup in the data pull that the pilot has to document. The LickDecoder software flagged Brittney's result as an imperfect match, citing untested genetic markers.
This provides a brilliant glimpse into the physical limitations of commercial consumer genetics. The pilot notes that the raw data was extracted using a specific microchip, the 23andMe V5 chip.
Right, and the manual explains that this commercial microchip doesn't actually sequence the entire mitochondrial circle. It operates using SNP arrays, meaning it only checks specific lattice points or individual genetic letters along the DNA strand, rather than reading the entire code base.
It's the equivalent of trying to read a 500-page novel, but you only have access to the first sentence of every 10th page. You can definitely get the overarching plot, you know who the main characters are, but you miss the granular nuance of the intervening text.
So the decoder wasn't satisfied.
The LickDecoder is a highly advanced piece of open-source forensic software. It demands a 100% whole genome, full sequence match to confidently, perfectly assign a highly specific subclade. Because the commercial V5 chip physically didn't test every single base pair of her mitochondria, the decoder flags the output as imperfect.
But the pilot assures her in the logs, do not let this trigger a system error or doubt in the telemetry. Based on the specific lattice points that were successfully queried by the chip, H5A1 is the definitive, undisputed macro assignment for her chassis. The assignment is accurate, the data pool just wasn't exhaustively sequenced.
The overarching truth is there.
But as I was reading this ancestral log, I noticed something else that I want you to clarify. The log for her paternal haplogroup is completely empty. It literally just reads null. Did the feral root fail to pull the data on her father's side?
No, it wasn't a software failure or a glitch in the extraction. It is simply a hard physical limitation of biological mechanics. Just as the maternal haplogroup traces the unbroken mother line using mitochondrial DNA, the paternal haplogroup traces the unbroken father line using the Y chromosome, which is passed exclusively from father to son.
And because Brittney's biological hardware is female, meaning her nuclear genome possesses XX chromosomes and no Y chromosome, she physically does not carry the hard drive required to run that specific diagnostic.
Exactly. The code literally does not exist within her specific biological node. To map the unbroken paternal telemetry for her side of the family network, the pilot notes that they would need to run this exact same bare metal diagnostic protocol on her biological father or biological brother who actively carries the Y chromosome chassis. It's an inherent limitation of her specific hardware build.
That makes perfect sense. And it sets the stage for what is arguably the most poetic, staggering revelation in the entire document. The manual contains a final collation section labeled the binary braid re-verified. The Force Tech software takes the deep telemetry of the two individuals we've been tracking throughout this narrative. James, the vanguard, the pilot who hacked the dashboard to pull the data, and Brittney, the architect weaver, the subject of the manual. And it places their deep ancestry side by side.
This is where we see the absolute brilliance and the profound weight of tracing the raw matrix of a familial network down to the bare metal.
Let's look at the final logs. James's mitochondrial baseline is mapped as H2A2A1. Brittney's baseline is mapped as H5A1.
The pilot breaks down the biological forensics of what this actually means. He points out that despite their different specific branches, they both operate on the exact same ancient mitochondrial foundation. They both belong to the overarching haplogroup H, the clan of Helena, as early population geneticists named it.
In fact, the manual notes a fascinating technical detail. The actual software used to map Brittney's DNA literally uses James's overarching haplogroup, specifically the H2 Cambridge reference sequence, as the mathematical baseline to map the mutations in hers.
If we pull back and connect this data to the macro reality of human history, think about what this physically dictates. Thousands and thousands of years ago, somewhere near the freezing glaciers of the Ice Age, their two distinct maternal lines shared the exact same physical node.
They shared an ancestor.
They shared a single specific grandmother. They were one unbroken line surviving the harshest climate in human history.
And then, as the generations passed, the matrix split. One daughter's line developed a specific mutation and took the H2 branch, marching down through thousands of years of history to eventually arrive at James. The other daughter's line developed a different mutation, taking the H5 branch, enduring the millennia to eventually arrive at Brittney.
The grand conclusion of this data synthesis is absolutely phenomenal. You have these two individuals existing today, attempting to navigate what the manual describes as the modern analog wasteland. They are running completely different operational protocols.
Completely different hardware setups.
One operates as the vanguard, built to clear the swamp and manage chaos. The other operates as the architect weaver, built to design the freehold and manage complex long-term structures. One might have a fast-clearing GG engine, the other possesses the slow-clearing AA engine. They require entirely different chemical fuels, they possess different physical chassis, and their firewalls manage toxicity at different rates.
But beneath all of the modern adaptations, beneath the COMT enzymes, the restricted MTHFR fuel pumps, and the fast-clearing liver firewalls, the deep bare metal foundation of their mitochondrial energy engines is rooted in the exact same Ice Age survival code. They are divergent expressions of the exact same ancient hardware.
It entirely reframes how we view familial connection and human resilience. It's no longer just about shared personality quirks or a resemblance in the eyes. It is a literal, verifiable biological tether stretching back through deep time, mapping both the divergence of their specific genetic adaptations and the relentless, unbroken survival of their shared lineage.
So let's take a breath and look at the sheer magnitude of what we have unpacked today. We started with the paradox of a flooded engine and a restricted fuel line. We traced the precise chemical synthesis of dopamine, and we exposed the critical biological need for bioactive L-methylfolate to bypass a broken enzymatic pump.
We covered a lot of ground.
We examined a rapid litter firewall that traps the slow-clearing brain in the exhaustion of bejangled nerve pops, and we decoded the tactical empathy protocol that requires lone wolf detachment to survive the invisible crush. And finally, we followed the biological blueprints all the way back to an Ice Age matrix split. We have painted a vivid, highly technical, and deeply mechanical picture of an architect weaver, a biological machine built for endurance, complex structural organization, and relentless resilience.
We decoded the manual. We understand exactly how her hardware operates, why the artificial structures of the beige world are so inherently toxic to her specific baseline, and exactly what fuels she requires to bypass the noise and thrive.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you step back into your own life. The manual explicitly stated that Brittney's greatest threat is the invisible crush of the modern chaotic environment and the synthetic one-size-fits-all assumptions of the beige world. If we all possessed our own bare metal diagnostic manuals, how many of our daily struggles, our chronic anxiety, our unexplainable brain fog, our deep systemic burnout, or our friction with the people we love are not personal moral failings at all? What if they are simply a case of putting the wrong biological fuel into an engine designed for a completely different environment?
What if you're a high-performance race car being driven like a tractor, or an architect weaver being forced to operate in the chaotic friction of the swamp?
Exactly. When you look at your own history, when you stare into the diagnostic muddy waters of your own biology, what might your own operating manual look like?